How can we do that, Paul? How can we give you joy? By being of the same mind, maintaining the same love, united in spirit, intent on one purpose, not being selfish or conceited, but humble, regarding others more important, and looking on the things of others and not your own. In other words, Philemon, if you will humble yourself and consider Onesimus more important than yourself and seek unity and love and fellowship and therefore forgive that man, you will bring me joy. And so he's saying, you should be motivated by wanting to be a blessing to others. You should be motivated to forgive because it will rejoice the heart of another. So he says, let me benefit from you in the Lord, and then adds, refresh my heart in Christ. Again, in that spiritual sphere. Bless me, refresh me. You refreshed everybody else back in verse 7. Now it's my turn. The forgiveness of Onesimus by Philemon will bring spiritual joy and refreshment because Paul loves both those men. Paul wants them to be one. Paul loves the unity of the church. Paul wants Colossae as a church to see that forgiveness as a great example, an object lesson. If Philemon refuses to forgive Onesimus, it will burden the heart of Paul. It will sadden the heart of Paul. It will trouble the heart of Paul because he loves both those men, and he loves that church, and he loves the unity of the church. Any failure to forgive will injure that relationship. It will injure that church. It will mar its ministry and its effectiveness, and it will misrepresent the power of the gospel to the unconverted world that's watching. So he simply says, you've been willing to do so much refreshing for other people. Would you just do this for me? Would you forgive this man and refresh me and bless me and give me joy? Two good motives to forgive. You owe more than you can ever pay. And if you forgive, you'll bless the saints because you'll pursue unity. Third motive. The recognition that I am called to be obedient to the Lord. Verse 21. Paul says, having confidence in your obedience, I write to you, since I know that you will do even more than what I say. Again, with pen in hand, Paul says, look, I have confidence in your obedience. And he touches that heartstring again in Philemon that is plucked by the need to obey God. He's not talking about being obedient to Paul, because back in the early part of the chapter, you remember Paul said to him, verse 8, I do have enough confidence in Christ to order you to do what is proper, yet for love's sake I rather appeal to you. So Paul never did command him. Paul is just saying, I know you'll obey the Lord in this. Paul is confident that Philemon is a godly man. He laid out his characteristics in verses 4 to 7. He is confident that he will act in a right way to obey God's command to forgive. Remember I told you that theology of forgiveness is not in this letter, but we can assume Philemon knew it. We can assume Philemon was well acquainted with Matthew chapter 6, with the principle there that if you don't forgive your brother, God's not going to forgive you. He was very familiar with Matthew 18 principles, like you must forgive 70 times 7, or as Luke 17, 3 and 4 tells us, you must forgive if need be 7 times a day. He was well familiar with the Apostle Paul's conviction, 2 Corinthians 2:7, that forgiveness was essential. He certainly was sure of what Paul said in Ephesians 4:32 and Colossians 3:13, though he hadn't read them, that he must forgive because he had been forgiven so much. Philemon knew that God commanded forgiveness. Paul is sure he knew it. That's why he doesn't bring it up. And Paul is even sure he'll do it. He says, I'm confident of your obedience. I know you're going to do what God commands you to do, and God has commanded you to forgive. And so you're motivated not only because you owe debts you can't pay, not only because of what he says in verse 20, you'll be a blessing and a joy to other believers, but because you know God expects you to obey. And then he even says this in verse 21, I know you will do even more than what I say. Now, some people have made the unnecessary assumption that this is some call to Philemon to emancipate Onesimus, to free him from his slavery altogether, but that isn't indicated in the text. When he says, I know you will do even more than what I say, it could be that he is meaning to say that you will be more grand in your forgiveness than I've even asked. You will be more magnanimous in your love toward Onesimus than what I have even assumed. You will give to him maybe a prodigal son type of celebration. Put on the ring and the robe and kill the fatted calf and call a celebration. Maybe that's the more that he will do. Or maybe the more that he will do is to take him back not only as a servant, and Paul does indicate that he's coming back as a servant in verse 16 when he says you'll not only have him in the flesh, but in the Lord. In other words, he'll serve you in the flesh, he'll also serve you in the Lord. And maybe that is the more that he's thinking of here. Maybe the more is you're not only going to return him to menial service as a slave, but you're going to give him liberty to do ministry because of his spiritual capabilities. And so you'll do more than just take him back and restore him to service. You'll give him opportunity to minister alongside of you. Maybe the more might be that you'll not only forgive him, but you'll forgive some other people you ought to forgive. And the more is a more magnanimous, far-reaching, and broad kind of forgiveness in which Philemon will even forgive those that Paul doesn't know he holds bitterness against. There are many possibilities for what the more might be, but he says, I know your character, I'm confident in it, I know you'll obey, and you'll even do more than I've even asked. Voluntarily, without coercion, not because of law, not because of fear, but out of a righteous heart, Philemon will obey God who commanded him to forgive.
You're listening to Grace to You, featuring John Macarthur, president of the Masters College and Seminary. In today's lesson, John continued his look at Paul's letter to Philemon. Today's lesson, a part of the series simply titled Forgiveness. John, the Bible clearly teaches that we should forgive someone who's betrayed our trust, but I'm wondering, is part of forgiveness restoring that trust? In other words, if you're going to forgive fully someone